Welcome to the Small Town Pastor Podcast. This podcast is a ministry of Small Town Network. We exist to make disciples, train pastors, and plant churches in smaller communities. My name is Eric Nielsen, and I'm joined by my co-host, Tony Colum. What's going on, Tony?
Hey, how's it going?
Good to see you. And again, we're joined by Dr. John Whittaker. How you doing, John?
I am doing good. Thanks so much,
I know
Mike.
you don't like being called that. You're just John, so it's
I'm
fun
just
for, it's fun to do that. Sorry.
Yeah.
If you guys, the listeners, if you caught the last episode, John talked about his ministry, the listeners commentary.com. If you haven't checked that out, you need to get the app. Works great. Today, we're going to talk about something a little different. We're going to focus in on something that John and I spent a lot of time talking about. And I know Tony's also talked about the same topic a ton with me, with John, and probably other people. We're talking about disciple making. So, we all know that when Jesus issued the Great Commission, the command in the Great Commission is not to go, it's not to baptize, it's not to, what's the other one? Teach to obey. It's the command, or if I'm remembering right, is make disciples, and then the rest of those things fill in how we do that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, man, I was nervous because you're a professor and I didn't want to get like a B minus
Yeah.
on my own podcast. So make disciples. We ask our church planters to wrestle with the question, what is a disciple? And then also a subsequent question is, how do I know I made one? If Jesus says make disciples, it's like, that's great, but how do we know we did it? And so that's kind of our primer for today. We're going to talk about this in this episode. So let's start by like biblically defining, if you could help us define what is a disciple? When Jesus says make a disciple, what is he saying to do?
Yeah. And it's not just theologically important. That's, pastorally and pragmatically important because a clear definition is going to be really important to helping whatever church you are planting or leading, understand what a disciple is and how to be one. It's going to help you communicate that much more effectively. So, having said that, Uh, I, I I think the key verse for that helps us understand what Jesus had in mind by that is Luke chapter 6, verse 40,
Okay.
because Jesus just assumes in that passage the sort of disciple making framework that was kind of embedded in his world. And we can overstate that from later rabbinic writings, right? And all that. But Luke chapter 6:40 still tells us that this is the way it basically worked in Jesus' world. Jesus says in that passage that a disciple is not above his teacher, but every disciple, when he's fully trained, will be like his teacher. That's the assumption in Jesus' world. To be a teacher or a rabbi and to have disciples means you're not just trying to help those disciples know what you know as a rabbi, you're trying to help them become what you are as a rabbi. So every disciple, when he's fully trained, will be like his teacher. And so, biblically speaking, that's what a disciple is. A disciple is somebody who's becoming like his teacher. In our
Ah,
case, our teacher is Jesus. So a disciple is somebody who has attached themselves to Jesus in order to become like Jesus. That's what a disciple fundamentally is.
so if we're using that word like generically, we could say, I know it's been popular, even a recent very popular book suggested that maybe a better word in English would be apprentice. But if we use it in a generic way, a disciple, if my friend is the welding professor at the local community college, so he's making disciples, right, in his welding shop, like he's teaching them how to do and be, but I just said that and I went, but not be necessarily. And disciple, like in the biblical sense, is not just know what your teacher knows, but be like your teacher. Would that be
Yeah. I mean, to do what they're able to do and to be like them both in behavior and in character. That's
okay?
kind of the idea. So your welding example, they're going to become like their teacher, then they'll have the character of a welder. They'll know how what to
Cuss and drink and no, I'm teasing.
not that kind of
If
character.
my friend listens to that, I'm in trouble. He's a
Yeah.
good
But
godly
that's the
man.
idea. The reason some suggest using the synonym apprentice for disciple is because when we think of like a student, right? we picture a classroom with rows, and the goal in the classroom is to take notes so that you can pass the test. Well, that's not the way discipleship worked in Jesus' world. The
Mm.
goal was you were to watch, you were to observe, you were to listen, you would have dialogue. So you're going to learn what the teacher knows, but the goal is not just to know the information, it's so that you can embody the, in Jesus' case, the kind of the way of life of the teacher.
No,
So
so, and if I'm right, if I remember back to my Bible college, classes and stuff, rabbis in general in those days would call disciples, right? So this was not something unique to Jesus, right? Like it wasn't something he invented. Like rabbis had disciples that would
yes,
learn their theology and travel around with them. And is that right?
yeah, that was a common feature of life in the day. The one difference is that typically a young person would actually ask a rabbi if he could be their disciple, and the rabbi would decide.
Oh,
Oh,
and Jesus did the opposite. He
He did
actually
the opposite. He initiated it. He called.
he initiated
right.
that.
That's why Jesus says later in his discussion with his disciples is, "You didn't choose me, but I chose you."
Hmm.
He's saying we did this different because I wanted you to be part of my team, my rabbi school. So
And so that's why, so like you said something important, I think that's near to like all of our hearts, like what we care about and how we do our ministry and stuff. It's not just a student in a classroom gaining information, but it's becoming like the teacher, our teacher who is Jesus.
yeah,
So it's not merely academic. You could be a great theologian and not be a disciple of Jesus, right?
exactly. Yep. You could be
Okay.
a great church member and not be a disciple of Jesus. And
Right.
I think
Right.
some of the ways we've done church for
Right.
the last 50 plus years, maybe longer, we've been really good at making church members,
Mm.
not necessarily really good at making disciples.
Right. So let's go back to the story you shared in the last episode. You were working at a large church that had a lot of momentum. They're growing very quickly, baptizing 100 people a year. But there was a sense that you had that you were not doing a great job at, discipling them past their baptism, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but something
Yeah.
like that. Tell me about that and do you feel like that's kind of symptomatic of what's going on in our churches in America or whatever? Take that however you want.
Yeah, yeah. Couple things on that. Yeah, we were baptizing people. So in that sense, we were making disciples, at least, Jesus said, make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy-" Well, we were doing that baptizing part, but the second part, teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded. We had no mechanism for that. We had
Hmm.
no mechanism to help people actually learn how to become like Jesus and learn how to do the things that Jesus taught. And we had no real environments or vehicles for that. We were trying various things, and we did get people in small groups, but we hadn't articulated clearly the goal. We didn't have a clear path for any of that. So a great example of what I just said of making good church members, but not always making great disciples. The first time in that congregation where I put up on sort of a discipleship path up on the screen in a sermon, after service, I had this guy milling around in the lobby, and it was very clear he wanted to talk to me, but he wanted people to clear out first. So once people cleared out, he comes up to me and he's like, "Hey, John, can I talk to you?" I said, "Yeah, yeah." And he's like, you put that thing up on the screen where it had like pre-faith, new faith, young faith, growing faith, mature faith, that discipleship thing up there." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I have been a Christian for about 10 years, and most of it have been going here to this church. And I would still put myself, I think, down in the new faith stage, or at best in the young faith stage."
Mm.
And what you need to understand is this guy was at church almost every Sunday. He served, he volunteered in the kids ministry, he helped out with the youth ministry, he was a greeter, he tithed on a regular basis. He was like, every pastor would love to have this guy as a church member. He was
We
helping
want
out.
no, we want 100 of those.
Right. Right.
Right. He was a great church member, but he just self-diagnosed himself as, "I'm a young, immature, not growing disciple."
Wow.
Huh.
And I asked him, I said, "Well, why do you think that is?" And these were his words: "Because no one told me where I was supposed to go."
Mm.
Hmm.
No one told me. He said, when I became a Christian, what I was told was you need to go to church, you need to serve and volunteer, and you need to tithe. So I've been doing those three things for over a decade, but I still have a lot of the same behavior issues I had a decade ago. I've got a lot of the same desires I had a decade ago, and I haven't radically changed. I I didn't know where I was supposed to go, and I didn't know how to get there. So what do I do now? That's
Mm.
what he wanted to know.
So when you say like there's no mechanism for discipleship, I know one question that gets asked in pastor circles a lot is, what do you guys do for discipleship? Like,
Yeah.
is that kind of what you're referring to? And how do we even, because it's to me, it's always been like a funny question. Maybe it's because I don't know how to answer it. But I guess if you're someone like me that's like, how do I even answer that question? Where do we even begin to go from? We don't have a mechanism to developing that ministry mechanism system, whatever it is you want to call it. Like, what are some of those steps to get there? Like for
Yeah.
that guy.
Yeah. At a real broad level, one of the things I'd like to tell pastors is that discipleship isn't something we do, it's
Hmm.
everything we do.
Hmm.
We have to shift our perspective that everything we do as a church is supposed to help people live and grow as disciples of Jesus. So whether a church has a discipleship pastor or not is okay, whatever. But we don't really need one because every pastor is supposed to be a discipleship pastor.
Right.
The children's pastor is a discipleship pastor focused on families and young children, right? Like everything we do should be helping people become disciples or grow as disciples. If it's not, why are we doing it? Because that's the one mission of God. So we have
Hmm.
to get our head around that in the church, that discipleship isn't something we do, it's everything we do.
Hmm.
I
Um,
wanted to just jump in real quick there because I was thinking I've heard people say, and I know what they mean when they're saying it, but they take discipleship as like worship leaders should teach other people to be worship leaders, and kids workers should teach other people to be kids workers, and they use the word disciple or discipleship or discipling or whatever
yeah,
to describe that. And I think that's kind of a hijacking of the term. It's not like conceptually, it's not inherently wrong. But as we think about like discipleship, it's and I love Luke 6:40 that you brought that up. And I was thinking to myself, I've known you for 20 years and you've never brought that verse up before. Why haven't I heard this? Um, um, because the goal is to be like his teacher. And so you could teach someone how to change diapers in the nursery or, be a youth group volunteer or whatever, and that has nothing to do with them being like Jesus. Right. So could this be like more, as we try to focus that in a little bit, is this like more of like the Second Timothy 2:2, or is it First Corinthians is it 11 where Paul says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ? Like I want you to emulate Christ in me. I want you to follow, like do what I'm doing as Christ is, like that. Is that really the heart of it? It's not like this
yeah,
generic thing of teaching people skill sets so we can grow our church bigger or whatever.
exactly. Exactly. I was sitting there thinking, you got to go to First Corinthians 11:1 in order to get that discipleship entails imitation necessarily. You're imitating Jesus, and that means you're imitating people who are imitating Jesus, right? Like it necessarily entails that. So Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. That's First Corinthians 11. But he says that all throughout his letters in various ways, right? The
Mhm.
things you've seen and heard and learned from me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Philippians 4:9.
Mhm.
So it's all over the place in his letters that for Paul, he this framework of discipleship shaped what he was doing in ministry, that he had a whole team of people, Timothy, Titus, Epaphroditus, others he called himself to work with him in ministry. And it wasn't just that he was teaching them how to plant churches, he was teaching them how to follow Jesus so that they could help other people follow Jesus. And churches were the result of that, right? And the same thing in our ministries within the church, that people who are leading ministries, first and foremost, aren't trying to get other people to know how to lead the ministry. They're trying to help other people have a concrete pattern of Christ likeness so that their ministry is an overflow of their Christ likeness.
Okay.
So
So if we define, we've kind of got a definition of a disciple? And then that second part was, how do we know we made one?
Yeah.
So if we're as leaders of churches or groups or whatever we're doing, and we really want to be disciple making disciples for Jesus, how do we know we're getting it right? Like, what would you say to that question?
Yeah. First off, how not to measure it.
Okay, I like that. Let's start
Yeah,
there.
I think that's really important
Church
because
attendance and tithing.
yeah, exactly. Like, how do we
Yeah.
how are we know we're being successful making disciples? Well, we have more people coming to church, we have more people giving money, and we have more people volunteering. So what?
Right.
You could have made a bunch of good church members, but not necessarily they're not becoming like Jesus. In the New
Go into all the nations and make church members. That's what
Yeah,
Jesus said, right?
so when you look at what Paul is doing, one of the things he's doing by writing the letters that we read in the New Testament is he's doing discipleship. His letters are a part of his discipling the people in those churches. He's doing discipleship in those letters. What are the kinds of things he emphasizes that he cares about? What are the metrics that he, if you want to use our language, that he brings up? Well, he brings up things like, um, so then, my beloved, as those chosen of God, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, gentleness, patience, and love, bearing with one another and forgiving each other, just as God in Christ forgave you. Colossians 3:12 through 17. Right? Those kinds of things. The character traits. Are we forming people who are embodying those kind of character traits or not? Ultimately, that's the target, right? The fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, those kinds of lists that the Apostle Paul gives in his letters, those are the fundamental metrics of discipleship and disciple making for the Apostle Paul. That's the target. That's what he's aiming. Those are the character traits that drove Christ's behavior in Christ's life. So those are the character traits that ought to drive our life as disciples, and that we ought to help drive other people's lives.
So you just said two things that I think are really important, and we kind of go back to this at our own church with it's not a metric like the way we think of it, and the things that you just listed as examples of Christ likeness are not things you can put on a spreadsheet,
Mm.
right? And I think is that just our Western mindset trying to quantify everything and measure everything and
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's you don't measure those kinds of character traits and qualities the same way,
Right.
but you do know when you yourself are growing in those things, right? And you can tell when other people are not or are growing in those things, right?
Right.
Like like if you have somebody who, you lead them to faith in Jesus, you baptize them, and you know there is an expectation that they're going to move towards Christ likeness, and you have means in your church to do that. And 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, you can look at them and say, that person, he's not nearly as grumpy and angry and caustic with people and with his own spouse and kids as he was just 3 years ago. You can
Wow.
see that, right? Like, it's anecdotal, it's not quite as concrete, you can't put it on a spreadsheet, but it is discernible.
So
hmm.
you're talking more really about developing a culture and philosophy within the church than a ministry program specifically.
Yeah. A I like to refer to it, a church should be a greenhouse for growing mature disciples. You create an environment and a climate in which the the norm is that people are actually becoming like Jesus from the inside out. Their character is being transformed because of their union with Jesus, and they're walking by the Spirit. There's an expectation of that, and there's concrete examples of that. There's wisdom for how that is deployed and how that happens. People know it, they can talk about it.
Mm.
I had a gal in a class at the Bible college a year ago who she was in her mid to upper 20s, and she said, I have been going to church for a decade, and it wasn't until this year in she changed to a new church here in town. She said it wasn't until this year that I had ever heard I was supposed to become like Jesus. She said, I don't know why that was so eye-opening to me. I guess I should have assumed it, but it's like I'd never been told that. It was like the lights came on for me.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
I'm supposed to be learning to follow Jesus so that I become like him, not just on the outside, but on the inside too. It was like, and it changed her world. All of a sudden, she now had a goal and a target. that simple concept was so embedded in the new church she was going to, that all of a sudden it drew her towards that because she now had that's what I'm supposed to be pursuing.
Well,
So
I think,
that doesn't seem that radical revolutionary, but it's amazing that someone like
yeah,
you go to a lot of churches and knowing you never
I,
get that the idea that that's what I'm supposed to be pursuing.
I think one of the pitfalls some of us pastors have is we kind of make assumptions about where people are at as well, when we don't like actually know them. Like we had a guy that was very consistently at the church at a men's breakfast thing, involved in kids stuff. But he came to me one day and in all honesty asked, why was he crucified 4 different times?
Oh
He
my God.
thought
Yeah.
that the Gospels were 4 different
No
accounts.
way. He read it
Yeah.
like a book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I was just like, wait, I was so taken back by that. So I like it blew my mind like, oh my goodness. And then of course COVID, it was like it was really apparent during COVID that we had a lot more church members than we had disciples
Yeah.
Mhm.
because they just fell off when they couldn't get what they wanted out of us in that moment versus
Right.
serving, contributing.
Yeah.
So I guess
Yeah.
all that to say, what are some like things we need to think about for intentionally pushing this philosophy and this culture
Yeah.
forward?
Yeah. And that word's really important. I don't think it's so much a discipleship program, but it still needs to be deliberate and intentional, right?
Hmm.
So here's a couple of key principles that I think ought to govern whatever we do in the church to say we're creating a discipleship culture. One is you got to have a clear path. Well, we should probably start sooner. You got to have a clear definition. We've given that in here. It doesn't have to be that definition, but a short, simple, sweet definition helps people. That you're a disciple, someone who's arranging their life to be with Jesus in order to become like Jesus.
Mm.
That's tells us what we're doing, arranging our life to be with Jesus, like a disciple to a rabbi, right? In order to become like Jesus, specifically in character and mission, like him in character and mission. So we got to have a clear definition. That's important. And we got to communicate that over and over and over again
Hmm.
in our church. We have to articulate a clear path. How does someone go from new to the faith to mature in the faith? What are kind of the steps along the way? What are the indicators that someone's moving down that path, right? So we have to articulate a clear path that moves people from new to Jesus to substantially like Jesus. What's the path for that? Um, we have to have an ecclesiology that embodies the one another's, right? We have to have a practical understanding of church where we actually practice the one another's, love one another, serve one another, bear one another's burdens, confess your sins to one another, pray for one another, all those one another's, right? Like discipleship. How can you say imitate me as I imitate Christ if they don't know you, if they don't see you?
That's a
If
great catch.
so we've got to be in each other's lives so that they can see how I treat my wife and how I treat my kids and how I treat my neighbors and all of that. So that
Mm.
in those places where I'm like Jesus, do what I do. In the places where I'm not, scrap that, find somebody else, right?
Right.
So you have to have a rich
Don't follow my bad examples. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
so we have to have that rich ecclesiology that practices the one another. So chart, a clear definition, a clear path, a one anothering environment in the church. We have to have those kinds of things. Um, and then the other thing I always like to advise pastors is you got to work from the inside out, not the outside in. And what I mean by that is let's not stand on the stage and announce we're going to start doing discipleship and here's our program and all that. Instead, let's start in the office discipling our fellow staff members. Let's get the elders into discipling relationships with people. Let's work from the inside for those people who get it, who are living it and who get it. Let's get them already embodying it and doing it. And over time,
Hmm.
it just becomes kind of the culture of the church. It's just what we do. We were and now kind of the expectation in the air we breathe in this group of people.
Hmm.
So
Right.
You said something that made me think there's a lot of discipleship, I think, that happens in churches that I would call incidental. Um, People are picking up things from other people, from other believers, from their pastor, from teaching, from whatever. If we're not doing intentional discipleship, probably in every church in some way, shape, or form, there's some incidental discipleship happening.
Mhm.
There's no real pathway. There's no programs that are geared that way, but it's um it's just kind of happening kind of generically. But what we're talking about is that intentional discipleship, like where we make that the focus. And this is my this can kind of we'll start kind of wrapping up for the sake of our time, but where did we get off track, John? I
Yeah.
mean, we see Jesus gathering disciples, commanding his disciples to go make disciples. The church takes the world by storm and rapidly multiplies. And then you fast forward 2,000 years, and it kind of feels like in the last 10 years or so, like the word disciple and discipleship is kind of making a comeback and people are talking about it more. But how did we get where we are? Do you have any sense of that you could explain like how we drifted away from like the original command of the Great Commission? Or did I finally stump you?
Yeah, well, you did stump me a little bit. I think there,
It's a
uh,
good word.
here, I'm going to give an answer with the caveat that I'm not an expert in church history. All
Okay,
right.
noted.
Yeah. My answer is when church became either you could describe it as a religious organization or big business,
Mm,
that's when we got off track. When it ceased to be primarily a gathering of people, gathering of disciples seeking to live together, full of the Spirit, and trying to both embody and display Jesus to the world. When that's what church was, good things happened. But when it became a religious organization that had to be maintained and managed,
mm,
then it became more about, well, we need church members to pay the bills, to keep the doors open, or we need to control people for whatever reason, right? And get aligned with political power in various stages of history and various places. So it seems to me that when it became more about running and managing and maintaining a religious organization than embodying Christ, I think that's where we got off track.
Okay.
yeah.
That's a good word, man. You know, I
Mm,
think that's it's weird for Americans, like, you know, I love being an American. We're all Americans, yay America and all that, but we've taken our American values and our American tendency to equate bigger with better,
mm,
faster, rapid growth with success. Um, and again, not no one in mind, not picking on anybody or running anybody down, but I found myself caught up in that kind of mentality. My mentors were discipling me in that way.
mm,
And it's like if you do this, this, and this, your church will grow. And then we equated the church growth with God's blessing. And so it's this kind of self-perpetuating cycle you get caught up in and you don't even realize it until I stepped out of that role and kind of said, let's put everything back on the table for discussion and draw it up different. And the second church that I'm planting and versus the first one I planted, very different, different emphasis, different things going on because we've decided to put not to put the form over substance. That might be a way to say it and to really work on, let's get this thing right, this part right. And the consequence of that is we're not as big, we're not growing as quickly. Um, but I think what we're growing is good. And I love that. I love that greenhouse
mm.
analogy. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, let me wrap with this. Discipleship, in a lot of small churches and small towns, um, it's been my experience. There's not a lot of like small group, not a lot of like intentional discipleship groups and stuff like that. It can be, I want to speak generically because I realize there's exceptions, but I've often seen kind of a Sunday morning centric um, kind of church. Um, how could you encourage small town pastors, small town churches what can they do that maybe even like, is there anything unique in those communities that might afford them the opportunity to really dig in and get intentional about disciple making?
Yeah. Um, one of the things that stands out to me is that one of the advantages of the small town. The principle is discipleship happens through a life on life transfer. It happens in those relational environments, right? So practicing the one another's. And one of the advantages of the small town is you bump into each other way more often in town. You shop at the same grocery stores, your kids go to the same schools. How could we tap that? How could we capitalize on those natural relational connections and create utilize those for the sake of practicing the one another's and letting those be touch points and even catalysts for relational connections that could become discipling relationships. And how could we encourage people to do the same sort of thing, right? Like how can we encourage our people to begin to see like, hey, if you know, Sue and Mary, you see each other at drop off frequently in the mornings when you're dropping kids off at school, you guys ought to seriously think about just grabbing coffee for 20, 30 minutes afterwards and praying for your kids together and talking about how it's going spiritually and turn those relationships into intentional spiritual relationships. And
Mm.
maybe it'll grow from there. Like you have it's easier to have relational connections in a small town than it is in a big city.
So
Just is.
if we're thinking of like relational discipleship, there's some advantages in smaller communities.
Huge advantages.
Mm.
Huge.
Hmm.
I love that.
If you're in a church of 3,000, that's the size of some of these smaller towns. And
Yeah.
you hardly ever see the people because because if it's a church of 3,000, you're all over the place. Your kids don't go to the same school. And but in a small town, I mean, Cuna, you know, 2 or 3 elementary schools, one junior high and one high school. That's what you got, right? And so it's like you see each other a whole lot more at school events and school functions. You can create relational connections that can become opportunities for spiritual encouragement, discipleship in a way that you can in big cities.
Mm.
Wow. Okay.
I
Well, man,
love that.
thanks for your time, as always. I feel like you have a product or not a product, but like a series or something on your website, um, that kind of speaks to this, like that's designed for churches to use for training. Do you want to give that a plug while we're
I
on?
mean, I have some online courses, that can be used in churches for this kind of stuff. So um, there's a Bible survey course, a basic how to study and understand the Bible course, a basic theology course, and then a practical theology of spiritual growth. So, as well as some of the mini courses in there, like how to read the Bible and pray and some of that sort of stuff. So I have some courses that some churches use for training people. They use sometimes in groups of 3 or 4 where they meet together, watch a video, discuss it together. So they use them as a discipleship tool and some of that sort of stuff. So
And is
that's
that available at the
that's on
listener
my John
commentary?
yeah, it's on my John Whittaker website. So johnwhittaker.net.
JohnWhitaker.net is where they can find it.
JohnWhittaker.net, and then it'll say courses on there. And if you follow that, you can take it from there. People can pay $10 a month and get access to all those
Oh,
courses and
great.
in there, that sort of way. So yeah.
Okay. Well, I would say that we'll put that in the show notes, but I'm not sure that I know how to do that yet. So
Figure it out.
It's super easy, and I can disciple you in how to
you can
do that.
There
disciple
you go. There
me
you
to put show notes in like Jesus. So, man, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. Be sure and
Yeah.
check out listenerscommentary.com. If you like what we're doing, please like or subscribe. If you're interested in Small Town Network, you can find us online at smalltownnetwork.com. And if you believe in the importance of planting disciple-making churches in smaller communities, we'd love you to prayerfully consider partnering with us in prayer and financial support. You have been listening to Small Town Pastor Podcast. See you next time.